Republicans in the Florida Senate are trying to pass a genuinely great bill that would help everyone from farmers to cell phone owners find affordable repairs for their devices when they break. This is called a right to repair law. Great bill. So, why on earth are Democrats in the Florida Senate trying to stop them? We'll tell you more about it in our latest update from the Florida Legislature's 2025 session. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents, which is a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. This is going to be an update from day 36 of the Florida Legislature's 2025 legislative session, which is 60 days long total, meaning we are 60% of the way home at this point. This is obviously a podcast that is often very tough on Republican politicians in Tallahassee, and there's a reason for that. Republicans control every layer of state government. They've got supermajorities in both chambers of the legislature. They control the governor's office and every seat on the cabinet. And we have a state government that is one of the most corporate captured state governments in the entire country. And as I say that, there's obviously, it may be difficult to come up with like sort of a neutral metric to evaluate this, but it is a very corporate captured state government. Let's just put it that way. We have state leaders that are constantly making decisions that take rights away from workers, that take leverage away from consumers, that take decision-making power and autonomy away from local communities, that shift the cost of providing government services off of businesses and on to working and middle-class families. And our state leaders are almost always making these decisions at the behest of the big business lobby, the lobbies for the biggest corporations of the world, all of which obviously have a presence in Florida. But with that said, there is often, I would say the most disappointing group in Tallahassee is often Senate Democrats. I have no idea what it is, but for years, Senate Democrats have governed like Republicans who are moderate on social issues, like indistinguishable on so many important economic issues. Like a couple that immediately come to mind that just seem especially egregious over the years. You might remember a couple of years ago, the Florida legislature passed a bill for the sugar industry that essentially protected the state's big sugar growers from lawsuits over public health impacts from what they call black snow, their practice of setting fire, pre-harvest fires to their sugarcane fields, which produce toxic ash that can fall on areas where people live. Whatever you think of the policy, maybe set aside the merits of the policy. And just for what it's worth, the policy ought to be that if we're going to ban the sugar industry from burning its fields when the wind is going to carry their ash over wealthy areas on the coast, we probably ought to ban it from falling on poor areas inland too. But set aside the policy anyway. This was a really damning bill, dangerous bill for Ron DeSantis. One of Ron DeSantis's sort of like a core strength of his political brand has been his willingness over the years to stand up to the sugar industry in a way that few Florida politicians ever have been able to, particularly politicians at his level, like governors. And this was a bill. This was a pure favor for the sugar industry that he was going to have to sign or veto. And yet you had Democrats in the Senate vote en masse for this bill. This bill, I went back and looked. This passed in 2021, Senate Bill 88. It passed by a 37-1 vote in the Senate. And of course, when Ron DeSantis signed it, he made sure to emphasize just how bipartisan this was. He even had a Senate Democrat or two with him at the signing ceremony. I mean, when is the last time you can remember Ron DeSantis talking about bipartisanship as a positive thing, right? This was absolutely Senate Democrats providing cover to the governor to sign this favor for the sugar industry. It is unfathomable to imagine Republican politicians doing the same thing for like a Democratic governor who is in a tough spot. Just impossible to imagine. Another example that comes to mind is, for my money, the worst bill the Florida legislature has passed in at least the last decade was Senate Bill 50. This is a bill we've talked about a number of times before, but it was one of, if not the largest tax shifts in Florida history. It essentially forced consumers in Florida to increase taxes on Florida consumers by more than $1 billion a year, and used all of that new money to cut taxes for businesses. It was, like I said, a more than $1 billion a year shift of the tax burden off of businesses and onto everyday Floridians. When that bill passed, Three Senate Democrats voted for it, including a guy, Jason Pizzo, who is now the Democratic leader of the Florida Senate. Like that says everything you need to know about Senate Democrats, as far as I'm concerned. And the reason I go on this rant yesterday is, or the reason I go on this rant today is yesterday the Senate Rules Committee took up a bill, Senate Bill 1132. This was actually one of the bills we talked about yesterday in our Rays of Sunshine show, trying to find like good things going through the Senate. This is a major right to repair bill. This is a bill that would provide farmers and cell phone owners, pretty big constituencies when you tie those two things together, with guarantee them the right to be able to access affordable repairs when devices break down, whether that's like a multi-million dollar John Deere combine or it's your iPhone, right? Instead of forcing you to have to go buy a new phone or a new tractor, this would require the companies that make them, companies like John Deere and Apple, to make sure that people have access to the parts, the tools, and the documentation they need to make repairs. Both the owners of these devices and independent repair shops. So there becomes like a competitive market for repairs. This is unequivocally a pro-consumer bill, and great news is it passed the Senate Rules Committee yesterday. It passed it on a 19-5 vote. Every one of those 5 votes against was Senate Democrats. This is just mind-blowing to me. I want to give a special shout out to Lori Berman, a Democratic senator from, I think, Palm Beach or Broward, South Florida somewhere. She voted for this. She's the only Senate Democrat on the panel, I think, that voted for this right to repair bill. So good for her. The other people, man, fire them into the sun. That is wild. I haven't actually gone back and watched this hearing, and I will, but I was reading some coverage of it, and one of the Democrats that voted against said something like, "I haven't heard anybody coming up here and making the case for why this is needed," or something like that. The bill is literally being sponsored by a farmer. Maybe listen to that guy on the issue of whether or not farmers need access to repair materials. Just unbelievable. Anyway, this is actually a good news story in that right to repair. Senate Bill 1132 passed the Senate Rules Committee. It is now ready for a full vote in the Florida Senate. Here is hoping it passes, and here's hoping it passes on a bipartisan vote. But if Republicans need to do this themselves, good on them. I'll happily celebrate them for doing the right thing on this issue. This is a good bill. Okay, so with that rant out of the way, let me jump on to just a couple of other things real quick. The big story broke in Tallahassee yesterday related to the session where McKenna Schuler, a reporter at the Orlando Weekly newspaper, the alt weekly in Orlando, that's what a great place to come up with a major scoop, found records that show that Ron DeSantis is the guy pushing bills in Tallahassee this year that would dramatically scale back the state's child labor laws. Ron DeSantis is a guy who seems to think that the kids yearn for the mines again. These bills, we've talked about them before, Senate Bill 918 and House Bill 1225, they would essentially allow businesses to put high school students on like 40-hour work weeks or on like overnight shifts on the night before an exam. They're just wild bills. They have advanced so far this session. They do seem to be in trouble. I sort of suspect everybody knowing that Ron DeSantis is the guy pushing it this year probably means these bills are not going to pass, given how little interest the Florida legislature seems to have in helping Ron DeSantis. And you know what, if that means they decide not to help Ron DeSantis put a bunch of children to work for adult hours, that's great. I'm glad it worked out that way. What's interesting about this, though, too, by the way, these bills, folks that have followed Florida politics fairly closely probably know that this was a big fight in last year's session too. And last year we got records that showed these child labor bills were written by a billionaire-backed right-wing think tank called the Foundation for Government Accountability. And so the bills this year that Ron DeSantis is pushing and that these records show his office was writing, essentially the same thing. They actually go a little bit further, but it's essentially the same stuff. And so what is going on here is now Ron DeSantis is sort of doing the Foundation for Government Accountability's dirty work for it. And you might ask why, but the answer here is there's actually a long history of the DeSantis administration working very closely with this particular entity. This entity, its main funder, by the way, a right-wing billionaire named Dick Uihlein. I think he's either in Illinois or Wisconsin. He's a Midwest guy. He's one of the biggest far-right Republican donors in the country. He has been a major donor to Ron DeSantis both as governor and when Ron DeSantis ran his sort of embarrassing campaign for president. Dick Uihlein was a major funder. That's the connection there. I'll throw a link to a story in the show notes, but a couple of years ago, we had a story on Seeking Rents that showed just how closely the Foundation for Government Accountability has worked with the DeSantis administration. And in fact, there's another example of that in this year's session. another couple of bills that are moving forward and I think are probably far more likely to pass than these child labor bills are Senate Bill 1238 and House Bill 1157. And these are bills that we've talked about them before on the show, that would further weaken the state's unemployment system, weaken from the perspective of workers, where Florida already has the worst unemployment system in the country for workers. This would make it even worse by giving businesses and state officials more reasons to disqualify workers from getting benefits. And the reason I'm singling them out this year, we know, again, these bills were around last year. We know they originate with the Foundation for Government Accountability, where it does a lot of work around trying to like prevent workers from accessing unemployment benefits. They often call them quote unquote program integrity bills. We knew this was an FGA bill last year, but we saw the records after session showed that it was Ron DeSantis' staff, his administration was running sort of point for the FGA. And the FGA was working through the DeSantis administration, and the DeSantis administration was the one working with the legislature to try and pass these bills a year ago. To my knowledge, I don't know if we've seen any sort of updated records to show this. This would be my guess is what's happening again this year. But it all speaks to the point that so much of what the governor is doing in this particular area, this anti-worker stuff, is about currying favor with national billionaire donors who might finance another run for president if he tries again in 2020, or who knows, even a Casey DeSantis run for governor if she actually follows through with that. So couple of those are all important bills to keep an eye on. And we'll throw a link to McKenna's story in the Orlando Weekly into the show notes too, so you can see the actual records. The last thing I'll mention today, I'm not a super expert on education policy. It's always been an area that I've never paid super close attention to, partially because there's a lot of great reporters that are familiar with education policy. It's not an area that tends to lack for coverage, but it was sort of interesting to see a bunch of really like pro charter school industry bills yesterday moved as like almost as a pack. Three that I'll mention off the top of my head, or not off the top of my head, but three that I'll mention that stood out to me. House Bill 443, which would essentially, among other things, it seems to like prohibit ways that you might enforce enrollment caps on charter schools. It also makes it easier for charter schools to buy surplus land from school districts, basically forcing school districts to give charter school companies or management companies or charter schools right of first refusal to buy surplus land and surplus facilities if they're going to try and sell them. There was also House Bill 123. This is a bill that makes it easier to convert existing traditional public schools into charter schools. Among other things, it would remove any vote that teachers have, which, again, I'm not an expert education policy reporter, but the idea that like we would take away any say of the employees in what happens to their workplace is pretty wild to me, and strikes me as to fit perfectly as a piece of what we're talking about. They're just stripping rights away from workers everywhere they can, right? And this is just in the education space. And then the other one is House Bill 569. And this essentially just imposes a bunch of preemptions that on local governments, on ordinances and rules and regulations and stuff that might inadvertently or unintentionally sort of stop a charter school from expanding. And so the one example that jumps out to me in this bill is it would prevent school or local county or local communities from enforcing vehicle stacking ordinances if the effect of that would be to like cap the enrollment capacity at a charter school. And this is just strikes me as a pretty wild thing to do. These ordinances exist so that you don't have like long lines of cars backing up through neighborhoods or business districts and screwing with traffic. This is actually an issue where I live in Orlando. There's a school where every afternoon this giant line forms of parents waiting to pick up their kids, and it it could make driving the neighborhood like a real pain in the butt. And this bill would essentially prohibit local governments from capping the capacity of a charter school if it might make those kinds of problems even worse. It's just seems like a really imbalanced thing to be doing, just in the goal of like helping. Charter Schools USA is a giant management company. They're lobbying for this bill. In fact, they testified for it yesterday in this committee. So all of those bills passed their final House committees yesterday. So they're all they're all headed to the House floor. So it seems pretty likely they're at minimum coming out of the House this session. I just took a quick look at the Senate companions. All of them have moved. They're not as far along, but they've all made it through a first committee. So these things are in place. So seems pretty likely that the charter school industry is going to be walking away from this session with a bunch of gold in its pockets. So All right, we will leave it there. Both the House and Senate are on the floor today, so we'll definitely have at least one more show this week, updating with floor action and maybe sort of setting the stage for the final week, because we're going to see the budgets of both the House and Senate come off the floors this week, so that'll set them up for budget conference, negotiating a final budget, which is kind of when the end game of session starts to come into focus. So. Okay, however you're watching or listening to this, if you don't mind, make sure to click like and subscribe just to help spread the word on this stuff. If you can, leave us a review or a comment or two. And if you haven't already, also sign up for the newsletter. The easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Okay, thanks so much, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.